Jonathan Roumie takes a steadying breath, his voice trembling slightly, as he leans forward on the pristine white couch of the morning talk show set. Caleb, I need to tell you about a dream I had 3 nights ago, he says, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Across from him, Caleb Morrison's typically assured expression begins to soften. The award-winning actor's confident posture shifts as something in Jonathan's tone, reverent, shaken, sincere, cuts through the television gloss. The studio lights seem to dim ever so subtly, as though sensing the sacred tension growing in the room. Jonathan clasps his hands tightly together, grounding himself in the moment. In this dream, I was standing in a garden, and Jesus was there with me, he explains. His voice, though quiet, begins to gain strength with each word. The camera catches Caleb's immediate reaction, a slight but unmistakable straightening of his back. His hands, marked by decades of experience and countless iconic roles, now grip the armrests of his chair as though bracing for impact. Something within him stirs at the unexpected weight of Jonathan's words. Vanessa Cruz, the poised and polished host, had introduced this segment as a casual conversation about faith in Hollywood, a light feature between two admired actors. Jonathan Roumie, known around the world for his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen, was there to promote the newest season of the series. Caleb Morrison, the legendary actor with a quietly devout background, had come to discuss his latest directorial work centered on biblical themes and contemporary faith. Neither Vanessa nor the millions watching at home could have foreseen what Jonathan was about to share. The dream had come during one of the most spiritually taxing weeks of filming. Jonathan had been weighed down by creeping doubts about his own worthiness, his motives, his calling. Was he portraying Christ as a vessel of God's love, or was he chasing applause, prestige, the illusion of sacred purpose? He had been praying fervently, asking God for clarity, for a sign, a whisper, anything to confirm that his work wasn't just performance, but obedience. In the dream, he says, now voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow echoing across the studio, Jesus looked directly at me. Caleb's eyes remain locked on Jonathan's. He doesn't glance away, doesn't blink. The audience is gone, the camera's forgotten. His famously composed demeanor, honed over years of red carpets and press tours, begins to flicker. The mask is slipping, revealing something raw, something real. Jonathan continues. And he said something I knew wasn't just meant for me. The studio audience has fallen completely silent. No coughs, no shuffles, no murmurs. Everyone senses they are witnessing something far more profound than another celebrity interview. Vanessa, who has sat across from royalty presidents and stars beyond number, leans forward now. Her cue cards dangle loosely in her hand, forgotten. The room is alive with something she can't quite name. The kind of presence you don't summon, but sometimes it just arrives. It's as though the Holy Spirit himself has entered through the cracks in Jonathan's voice and filled the air with reverence. Jonathan had always been reserved about his personal relationship with Christ. He let his portrayal speak louder than his words. Raised by an Irish Catholic mother and a Syrian Orthodox father, his understanding of faith had been deeply lived, not loudly performed. It wasn't a brand, it was a breath-by-breath way of moving through the world. His journey to portraying Jesus hadn't been some savvy career leap, it had been a divine ambush. He hadn't chased the role. The role found him, and with it came a weight, that no amount of training could prepare him for. Years before, The Chosen, Jonathan had been a struggling actor in New York and Los Angeles. He'd waited tables, recorded voiceovers, done what he could to pay rent while chasing the dream. But even in those leanest years, something deeper had stirred in him. He had often wondered whether his dreams were selfish or sacred. Were they detours or part of a divine design? He had spent countless afternoons sitting in empty churches, lighting candles, and asking questions only God could answer. And in those moments when he prayed, not to be famous, but to be faithful, he began to understand his path wasn't about screens. It was about surrender. Caleb too carried a complex relationship with faith. Raised in a Pentecostal home, he had encountered God in a thunderous, undeniable way at 20. But fame had blurred the lines. There were decades of wrestling with what it meant to be both a public figure and a private believer. The spotlight had a way of distorting what was once simple. And while he rarely spoke of it, faith had guided every major decision in his life, sometimes painfully, always deeply. Then Jonathan says something that makes Caleb sit up straighter. Jesus told me about someone, he says, locking eyes with Caleb. His voice is calm but firm, unshaken. He described a man, someone gifted beyond measure. A man who's inspired millions, but who's struggling with something buried deep in his heart. The camera catches it a flicker in Caleb's gaze. Something is cracking. Not from weakness, but from the overwhelming strength it takes to let your soul be seen. The words hang in the air like a bridge suspended mid-construction, linking two souls who barely know each other, and yet, in this moment, feel divinely appointed to stand face to face. Caleb's breathing deepens. His chest rises and falls slowly, heavily, like a man bracing for a revelation he both craves and dreads. Backstage in the green room, Celeste Morrison watches intently from a monitor. She notices the shift in her husband instantly, the way his shoulders draw back, the emotion flickering in his eyes. Her pulse quickens. She has prayed with this man, fasted with him, watched him war in the spirit behind closed doors. And the look now crossing his face, she's seen it before only in the most sacred corners of their marriage. Jonathan's voice cuts gently through the quiet. The dream was unlike anything I've ever experienced. He explains, his tone more steady now, yet still tender. Jesus and I were walking through a garden, but it wasn't bound by time. It was as though heaven had pressed through the veil and breathed life into everything. He describes trees that shimmered with light flowers that seemed to sing without sound, an atmosphere so full of divine presence, it was difficult to breathe, yet impossible to look away. There was peace, he says, but also urgency. Like every word carried eternal weight. And then Jesus began to speak not about Jonathan, but about a man. Jonathan pauses, his voice gaining conviction. He told me, this man has been carrying a burden for years, a heavy one, something he thought he had to bear alone because of his position, his influence, because so many people rely on his strength. Across from him, Caleb's legendary composure, so often praised by critics and interviewers alike, begins to unravel. His jaw tenses, his lips part ever so slightly, and his eyes, those iconic, expressive eyes, begin to glisten. He is no longer the actor. no longer the icon. He's just a man. On the opposite end of the set, Vanessa Cruz sits frozen in her chair, forgetting her script, her cue cards, the cameras. Her producer has gone silent in her earpiece. No time cues, no commercial break alerts, nothing. And for good reason. This moment isn't made for television, it's interrupting television. It's something sacred, fragile, and incandescent. Jonathan continues, and with each word, something holy settles into the studio like fog drifting from the heavens. He had rarely shared the most intimate parts of his spiritual journey, not even with close friends. As a child, he would linger alone in churches, captivated by stained glass depictions of Christ. The images spoke to him, called to him. His Syrian roots gave him a deeper sense of Jesus, as not only Savior, but as a historical flesh and blood man who walked ancient earth. A man who bled, who wept, who loved. And during the hardest years of his acting career, when dreams seemed far and food was uncertain, Jonathan often found himself slipping into quiet sanctuaries at midday. Sometimes with nothing but exhaustion and a whispered prayer. Over time, prayer stopped feeling like ritual. It became relationship. He spoke to Jesus like a brother, a confidant, a friend who understood the weight of failure and the ache of calling. This intimacy, this sacred rhythm eventually became the soil out of which his portrayal of Christ grew. But even with all this, he still felt unworthy. Still felt like the robe didn't quite fit. And now, as he speaks with eyes filled with fire and tenderness, Caleb recognizes something familiar in him. It's the same light he saw in the eyes of his childhood pastor, in the voice of an old woman who once prophesied over him when he was 20 and doubting. It's the rare transparency of someone who isn't performing holiness, but living it. And that recognition, quiet and powerful, cracks something open in Caleb's soul. Jonathan's voice shifts. It now carries a weight that is unmistakable. In the dream, he says, Jesus showed me this man's heart. He showed me the love he has for his family, his desire to use his platform for good, the way he gives without recognition, helps in secret, lifts others without asking to be lifted himself. Each word seems to strike at Caleb's carefully built image, the one the world sees, but it doesn't destroy it. It reveals it. Beneath the accolades, beneath the prestige, there is still a boy who longs to be seen by God. If you believe God sees your heart the way he sees Caleb's, Jonathan says softly, turning slightly toward the camera, comment, I believe below. Caleb's eyes overflow, not with spectacle, but with surrender. His hands, which had been gripping the chair's arms like a soldier holding position, now rest open on his knees. It's a subtle shift, but profound. No longer resisting, now receiving. Behind them, seasoned camera operators and crewmen and women who've filmed hundreds of interviews, managed egos and breakdowns and commercial chaos, now find themselves wiping away tears. Quiet sniffles echo behind the boom mics. They know what this is. This isn't acting. This is presence. The words hang in the air between them like a bridge suspended in golden light, being woven moment by moment, connecting two souls who, though virtual strangers, feel unmistakably summoned to this encounter. Nathaniel's breath deepens. His chest rises and falls with a trembling steadiness, as though he's bracing for something he both aches and fears to hear. Backstage, his wife Celeste watches him closely from the green room. On the monitor, she sees the subtle shift in his posture, the softening in his face. Her heart picks up pace. She has shared a lifetime with this man. She knows that look. It's the same expression she has seen only during their most sacred private moments of prayer, when his soul seemed to be listening for something far beyond the noise of this world. Jonathan begins to speak. His voice gentle, but underpinned by something weightier than emotion conviction. The dream felt different, he says. More real than waking life. Like we were outside of time itself. He tells them how he walked with Jesus in a garden where every tree and petal shimmered with a kind of divine breath. It wasn't merely beautiful, it was alive with a sacred urgency. And in that place beyond time, the Savior spoke of a man. And Jonathan somehow knew without a doubt, that this man's story wasn't meant to be hidden. He said this man had carried a burden for years. Jonathan continues, his voice gaining strength like a current building under calm water. A weight he thought he had to carry alone. Because of who he is. Because others looked to him for strength. Because he didn't want to let anyone down. Nathaniel's eyes begin to glisten. The calm, controlled composure that had defined his public image for decades now begins to tremble at its edges. He is no longer the unshakable leading man, but something far more real, something far more beautiful. In the control booth, Serena Morales sits frozen headset, askew, eyes wide. She's watched thousands of interviews in her career. But this isn't television. This is something else. Even the producer in her earpiece has gone silent. The studio has become holy ground. No one dares mention commercials. No one even breathes too loudly. Jonathan presses on. The tone of his voice, though still warm, begins to vibrate with the kind of power that makes people straighten their backs without knowing why. My journey to faith wasn't always visible, he admits. As a boy, I would sit alone in old churches, not because anyone told me to, but because I felt drawn there. Like something or someone was waiting. He paints the image a little boy, tracing the outlines of saints in stained glass, whispering prayers to a God he spoke to like a friend. His Syrian roots gave him a rare intimacy with the places Jesus once walked, details that later colored the role he would inhabit so reverently. But long before cameras rolled, long before scripts were handed out, Jonathan had already spent years in quiet sanctuaries, having conversations with a Savior who never felt far. Acting came with struggle, he confesses. And in the waiting, in the silence of rejection, I'd go to the sanctuary, not to perform but to rest, to ask questions, to listen. That's where I learned to pray not with formality, but like a child, talking to someone who truly sees him. Nathaniel listens, and what he sees in Jonathan now is something he's only seen a few times in his life, in his grandfather's old preacher, in the eyes of a dying mentor, in a stranger who once prayed over him at an airport. That rare light, that rare clarity, the unmistakable mark of someone utterly transparent to God. Jonathan's next words come not from memory, but from the marrow. In the dream, he says quietly, Jesus, let me see this man's heart. The room stills further. I saw how deeply he loves his family, how fiercely he wants to use his influence for good. and how, behind closed doors, he's lifted others up, paid bills in secret, prayed over strangers. Not for applause, but because it's who he is. Each word lands like a drop of water on dry earth. And Nathaniel, who has spent a lifetime building a fortress of strength, suddenly finds his walls weeping. If you believe God sees your heart like that, raw, real, beautiful type, the words I believe in the comments below. Nathaniel's eyes are now fully wet, the tears no longer held back by pride or professionalism. Yet he sits tall, steady, open. His hands rest gently on his knees, now no longer clenched, no longer defensive. A man receiving, and around him, the crew, some who've worked in the business for 30 years, wipe their eyes in stunned silence. This is no script, no act. They are watching something far greater than a segment. They are watching a soul bloom in the light. Jonathan had never planned to reveal something so deeply personal on national television. But as he had prepared for this very interview, he couldn't shake the persistent stirring in his spirit. During his morning prayer, the face of a man, one he respected deeply, had come to him again and again. Not just a vague impression, but a crystal clear prompting that this conversation was meant for more than just promoting a television show. Something sacred was at stake. The dream he'd had the night before had felt like a divine transmission, what he later called a heavenly download. It wasn't vague or symbolic. It was filled with razor-sharp details that he couldn't have possibly known on his own. The man in question was Marcus Ellington, the legendary actor whose intensity on screen had captivated generations. But behind the scenes, few knew the spiritual backbone that had helped Marcus navigate Hollywood's murky waters, his longtime mentor, Reverend Elijah Rhodes. Their friendship wasn't for show. It was forged in hours of heartfelt talks, scripture reading, and accountability. Reverend Rhodes had been the one to tell Marcus years ago that acting didn't have to be vanity, it could be ministry. That his gift wasn't just charisma but a calling. Still, Marcus had carried hidden doubts, questions about worth, about whether he was truly walking in the purpose God had whispered to him when he was just a boy. Jesus showed me something, Jonathan said softly, as if he were receiving the words even as he spoke them. Something that happened when he was just a child, maybe 8 or 9. A moment when he first heard the call of God. Marcus's eyes flickered a barely perceptible twitch, but his breath caught in his chest. Only his immediate family had ever known about that day. It wasn't a story for interviews or awards banquets. It was holy ground. Jonathan continued almost in a trance, describing a small Pentecostal church in Yonkers, New York. A cramped sanctuary filled with tambourines and the scent of anointing oil. A young boy standing beside his mother during a raucous altar call. The music faded in his ears, and all he felt was the overwhelming weight of divine presence. The boy Marcus had stepped forward, tears spilling down his cheeks, offering his life to Christ with a sincerity rare for any age. That moment had shaped his entire understanding of purpose. And now, somehow Jonathan was recounting it in stunning detail on live television. Offstage, the show's host, Vanessa Morales, shot a look to her producers behind the cameras. Their expressions hovered between awe and panic. This wasn't the segment they'd prepped. This wasn't soundbite friendly or easily clipped for social media. But no one dared interrupt. Everyone sensed something much larger than television was unfolding right in front of them. He prays late at night. Jonathan said next, his voice trembling with emotion. Deep, aching prayers about whether he's doing enough, about whether all this success has somehow dragged him away from what God really had in mind for his life. Tears were now streaming freely down Jonathan's face. He wasn't performing. He was delivering something, someone's message, and every word landed like a thunderbolt in Marcus's chest. They struck places he'd carefully kept hidden: doubts, guilt, even resentment. For years he had questioned whether the gold statues on his shelf and the applause of crowds had come at the expense of his soul's true calling. In truth, the biggest struggles of Marcus's faith hadn't happened on camera or at award shows, but alone at 2 a.m. in his study, kneeling beside a leather chair, whispering into the silence. Prayers filled with wrestling, with surrender, with pleading, and no one had ever heard them until now. The audience, which had been restless and chatty just minutes earlier during the commercial break, now sat frozen in reverent silence. A few viewers were sobbing openly. Others bowed their heads in prayer. Many raised their phones not out of disrespect, but to record what felt like history. The room wasn't just quiet, it had changed. The very atmosphere had shifted thick with something unseen, like the hush of a sanctuary. Even the most skeptical crew members, those who had rolled their eyes at the pre-show prayer circle, now stood wide-eyed, their hands trembling as they adjusted camera angles and boom mics. Jonathan hadn't come to this moment casually. His portrayal of Christ had required more than costume and script. He'd buried himself in scripture, consulted theologians, and read the early church fathers. But more than all that, he'd spent countless nights on his knees, begging for an intimacy with Jesus that would make the role something more than acting. Something real, something alive. He had fasted regularly, spent hours in meditation, and cultivated such a profound prayer life that even his closest friends began to notice a change in his very being. A serene radiance now seemed to emanate from him. Jesus showed me something beautiful about this man's wife, Jonathan says, now turning his eyes gently toward the camera as though speaking directly to Celia. He showed me how she has been his steady anchor, how her unwavering faith has fortified his own, and how their marriage has become a living reflection of Christ's love for the church. Backstage, Celia Harland feels her knees begin to give way as this stranger, this actor-prophet, begins voicing sacred truths about her marriage. Truths he could not possibly have known on his own. Their union had indeed been carved and refined in the furnace of spiritual fire. Celia had often been Everett's spiritual compass during moments when the glare of Hollywood threatened to pull him off the path of grace. Their private prayer sessions had become a refuge over the years, a sacred canopy that shielded their marriage through storms both public and private. It was in those quiet candlelit evenings, just the two of them, knees to floor, hands clasped, that they rediscovered purpose and peace again and again. The world saw fame and fortune, but behind the scenes, it was prayer that held them together. Everett Harland's composure finally begins to crack under the weight of what is being spoken. A single tear slips from his right eye, tracing the well-worn creases of a face both celebrated and weathered. Then another follows. His chest rises and falls more slowly now, and his hands, those hands that had held Oscars and shaken presidents tremble. The cameras do not look away. They record the precise moment when one of America's most beloved performers lets his soul breathe before millions. But here's what broke my heart in the dream, Jonathan says, and his voice catches thick now with emotion. Jesus told me about the loneliness this man sometimes feels. How the very gifts that have blessed so many have also built walls that keep him apart. The words cut through decades of carefully managed image and performance. They strike something raw and buried, something Everett himself had never dared name. The truth is, fame had often been a gilded cage. Behind the curtain of applause, there was silence. Behind every interview, 100 unspoken doubts. Being Everett Harland meant always being the one who had it all together. The mentor, the moral compass. The man with the answers. Even among fellow actors, he wore the mantle of the unshakable one. But the truth was, the pressure of public virtue often came at the cost of private solitude. It had been his invisible burden for years. Jonathan, in his own meteoric rise to recognition through The Chosen, had tasted a drop of that same cup. Letters from strangers pouring out traumas, requests for intercession. The knowledge that his every gesture might be held up as a sermon. It had shown him the paradox of platform. The more people see you, the less they truly know you. Jesus wanted me to tell you something specific, Jonathan says now. Locking eyes with Everett, with such gravity, the room seems to still. He sees your heart. He knows your struggle. And he is proud of how you've used the stage he gave you. The silence that follows is holy. It hangs thick like incense. Everett no longer holds back. The tears fall freely now, as if a lifetime of doubt, exhaustion, and self-scrutiny has found its answer in one single sentence. Across the stage, veteran journalist Monica Reyes finds herself reduced from host to humbled witness. Her trained instincts to follow up, to pivot, to ask a thoughtful next question are useless here. She folds her hands in her lap and does something she has never done. While filming, she prays, silently, reverently, overcome by the sacredness unfolding before her. Jonathan continues now, detailing moments from the dream that touch on Everett's private generosity, his decades of anonymous donations to faith-based initiatives, his scholarship programs for students in impoverished communities, and the ministries he had quietly funded around the world. I saw the faces of those you've helped. Jonathan says, eyes closed now, as though watching them in real time. I saw young people walking into callings they never dreamed of, because you made a way. Everett sits motionless. How could this man know? He had always been deliberate about discretion, following Christ's own teaching to give in secret. Not even some of his closest friends knew the extent of his philanthropic work. And yet, here it was spoken aloud with uncanny precision. Jesus sees what the world never does. That's what Jonathan was saying. And Everett hears it not as flattery, but as confirmation that every anonymous act had echoed in heaven. In the dream, Jonathan says, now voice rising, Jesus showed me your future. The studio goes still. There are stories you haven't even imagined yet. Projects you haven't dared dream of. And they will carry his light into places so dark only your voice can go there. The prophetic charge breaks through the barriers of time, speaking not only to Everett's present, but calling out the road ahead. For years, Everett had sensed stirrings, divine nudges about films or scripts that seemed to come with an unseen assignment. He had chosen some roles because of that inner conviction, even when agents protested. Now it all made sense. Now he knew the whisper had been real. And that whisper was calling again, louder, clearer, with the backing of heaven itself. The studio cameras continue rolling silently, bearing witness as what began as a routine celebrity interview now unfolds into what can only be described as a modern-day prophecy. Members of the technical crew, many who had long identified as agnostic or entirely secular, stand motionless behind their equipment, visibly stirred by something they can't explain. In the days that follow, several crew members will quietly share that they began attending church again for the first time in years. Something unseen but undeniable had shifted within them that day. Jonathan continues, now recounting how in his dream he saw Everett, not merely as an actor but as a kind of modern prophet anointed to speak truth through the lens of cinema and the power of story. The vision had shown audiences across nations, weeping hearts opening to God's love and lives being redirected through the very narratives Everett would help bring into existence. The calling was not just entertainment, it was evangelism. Jesus told me about your prayers for your children, Jonathan says softly. His words gentle, but laced with deep conviction. How you've struggled to protect them while letting them find their own paths. The statement slices cleanly through Everett's emotional armor. For years, he and Celia had labored in prayer for their kids, asking for wisdom to raise them in the glare of Hollywood while keeping them grounded in truth. The tension between shielding them from harm and releasing them to live out their unique callings had consumed countless family dinners, bedtime conversations, and whispered midnight prayers. To hear that internal battle, named aloud, with such tender accuracy, confirms for Everett what he has always hoped, that God sees even this struggle, that heaven is intimately aware of the prayers of a father's heart. As the interview continues, Everett's emotional defenses dissolve. The usual calm, measured responses are replaced by genuine, raw reactions. His breathing unsteady, his eyes misting over. Several times he closes his eyes as though praying silently or absorbing what feels like direct divine communication. The studio audience too remains silent, enthralled, reverent as one of their cultural icons lays his soul bare before God and man. In the dream, Jesus showed me something about your legacy. Jonathan continues, his voice carrying an uncanny calm. He seems completely unaware of the cameras or the fact that millions are watching live. It's not the awards that will matter in eternity, not the honors. It's the quiet acts of obedience, the times you chose God's way over the worlds when no one else saw. The words land like holy thunder in Everett's soul. Throughout his decorated career, legacy had always lingered in the back of his mind. What would remain when the lights faded and the credits rolled? Awards could tarnish contracts, expire, but had his life counted for something eternal? That question had haunted his midnight hours, driving long conversations with God, in trailers, hotel rooms, and on quiet drives home from film sets. To hear that his hidden yeses, the quiet decisions made in faith, had been seen by heaven, brings a flood of relief and reverence he can hardly contain. Across from him, Monica Reyes knows her show's format has completely unraveled, and she doesn't care. She realizes this will be the most watched episode in her program's history, not because of clever questions or celebrity gossip, but because something eternal is taking place. In her earpiece, the producers, normally a constant stream of commands and countdowns, have gone silent. No cues, no time checks, just awe. Behind the scenes, social media erupts with clips, reactions, and open weeping from viewers who don't know how to process what they're watching. And Jonathan, his face is soaked with tears, his voice trembles, his very being seems to shimmer with something not of this world. Jesus showed me how deeply he loves you, he whispers, not just for what you've done, but for who you are. For your private moments of struggle, your unseen kindness, your questions and doubts. The love he saw in the dream overwhelms him even now. He struggles to find language for it, this divine affection that had poured over Everett like a river in the vision. Jesus wants you to know, Jonathan continues, voice cracking, that every prayer you've whispered in the dark, he heard it. Every moment you felt unsure, every time you wondered if you were on the right path. He was right there. Everett's jaw tightens as emotion overtakes him. These words speak directly to the invisible wounds he's carried. The quiet seasons of spiritual warfare, the stretches of inexplicable discouragement, the sudden tension in family relationships, the moments when, despite his confidence on stage, he had felt entirely alone. He had rarely spoken of these battles, but he had lived them. And now, someone who could not possibly know of them was speaking them aloud with divine precision. He finally feels seen. In the dream, Jonathan continues, I saw you as a young man. His voice is steady, but the moment feels heavy with significance. I saw the moment you chose to use your platform for God's glory, even though it meant giving up other opportunities. The audience leans in. Jonathan describes a specific choice Everett made early in his career, a quiet prayer in a film trailer, a decision to walk away from a lucrative but morally compromising role, choosing instead a lesser-known project that aligned with his faith. No one but Celia had known that moment ever happened, yet here it was spoken with uncanny accuracy. The entire studio falls into a holy hush. Not even the usual sounds of coughing, shifting seats, or stage directions interrupt the moment. Viewers at home are equally silent, many openly crying as the sacredness of what they're witnessing becomes undeniable. Even the crew, usually engrossed in technical adjustments, are transfixed. Several camera operators later admit they barely remembered filming. They were too caught up in what they felt. Jesus showed me something beautiful about how you relate to him. Jonathan says now, barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling every corner of the room. He said, you talk to him not like a distant deity, but like a friend, like a father. Tears well up in Everett's eyes once again. This detail, this seemingly small, simple observation touches the most foundational part of his walk with God. For decades, Everett's prayers had been raw and unpolished. No grand rituals, just whispered thoughts, casual mid-sentence thanks, honest midnight confessions. He had cultivated a friendship with God, not just a faith. It was that daily conversational intimacy that had kept him anchored while the world around him surged and swayed. Jonathan then shares how in the dream Everett's prayers had shaped his children. That even in moments of their rebellion or questioning his consistent example of faith had left deep roots. He saw images of family devotions, spontaneous bedtime prayers, and countless tiny seeds of faith being planted. Seeds that would bloom in ways Everett might not witness this side of eternity. For Everett, this is everything. If he had ever feared failure, it was in his role as a father, wondering whether he had done enough, modeled enough, loved enough. Now, with tears streaming, he feels peace. Not because his kids are perfect, but because he hears that God was working all along. In the dream, Jonathan says his voice suddenly charged with a holy seriousness. Jesus told me there's a moment coming in your future, a decision that will define the final chapter of your calling. And with that, the room seems to hold its breath. The words carry a weight that reverberates through the studio like a silent thunderclap, suggesting this divine encounter is not only about the past or present, but also about the future Malcolm hasn't yet walked into. It's a message of preparation, of purpose, yet to unfold. The prophetic edge of Jonathan's revelation adds a startling layer of intensity to what was already a moment soaked in spiritual gravity. Malcolm Rhodes' eyes widen, not with fear but with that raw awe a man feels when he realizes he's being handed divine intelligence about the road ahead. It's not just a reflection, it's a compass. Guidance for decisions that haven't yet presented themselves, yet carry eternal weight. It's exhilarating. It's terrifying. It's holy. The responsibility of receiving such precise divine direction is humbling, nearly unbearable in its majesty. On the sidelines, Camila Reyes, once just the poised and polished host of a live television segment, now finds herself drafted into the role of witness. Not to a celebrity interview, but to prophecy. She silently whispers a prayer for Malcolm, no longer concerned with camera angles or ratings. Her eyes welling with tears as she watches him visibly tremble under the glory of it all. Jesus wants you to know, Jonathan continues, his tone unwavering, his gaze locked somewhere beyond the veil, that your best work is still ahead of you. He speaks as if the studio has disappeared, as if the lights and crew and world outside no longer exist. Only the message matters. The stories you will tell, the lives you will touch, the kingdom, impact you will leave, it's all been planned in advance. The words shoot through Malcolm like an arrow made of fire and hope. Every lingering shadow of doubt, every quiet question he's carried in his later years about relevance, about whether his voice still matters, melts away. The possibility that his most sacred work is still in front of him, not behind him, lights a flame deep in his spirit. He had sometimes wondered in moments of silence whether the applause had been the peak, whether age or fatigue or time had dulled his edge. But now a divine reminder ignites him again. Jonathan continues painting the vision he saw in his dream. A project that will be born out of this very moment. A collaboration between the two of them that neither man expected, but which in heaven's eyes had already been set in motion. He speaks of scenes and sounds of an outpouring that will move millions. A wave of truth and art and spirit colliding into something that defies genre and touches eternity. I saw the ripple effects, Jonathan says, his voice cracking with wonder. I saw people watching this moment right now, and making decisions to follow Christ. Not just because of the message, but because they saw two men be vulnerable before God on national television. His words echo into eternity. The scope of this moment grows exponentially, no longer just about two artists or a dream or a broadcast. It's about lives across the world being pierced by a love that refuses to stay silent. Hearts softened, souls stirred, chains broken, and Malcolm breaks. Finally, his carefully composed exterior, his legacy of stoicism, of quiet strength, collapses under the gentle flood of divine validation. His shoulders quake. Tears stream unrestricted, unashamed. He no longer tries to preserve the polished image the world expects. Right now, he's not a legend, not a brand, just a son being held by his father. The cameras don't cut, they roll. They capture a moment that would echo across social media television replays, YouTube reaction videos, and Sunday sermons. But none of that matters to Malcolm. Not now. Not in the sacred hush of this unveiling. Behind the scenes, camera operators and producers are crying too. Even hardened crew members, veterans of Hollywood and newsrooms alike, feel something stirring inside them. Some don't know what to call it. Others recognize it instantly. God is here, and he's not playing games. Jonathan's final words hit like a tidal wave of mercy. The last thing Jesus told me in the dream. He says, his own voice fraying beneath the emotion, is that he's proud of you. Not because of the awards, not for the fame, but for the man you've become when no one is watching. His words are soft now, but they strike deep. For choosing love over fear, faith over doubt, obedience over convenience. These words of divine approval wash over Malcolm like a healing balm, soothing wounds he didn't even know he carried. As Jonathan finishes sharing the dream, a profound silence descends upon the studio, an otherworldly hush that seems to stretch beyond natural quiet into something deeply supernatural. Malcolm sits completely still, tears spilling freely down his face, his breath ragged and deep like a man who's just run a marathon. Only this one was spiritual. The weight of divine presence thickens the awe, draping itself across the room like an invisible mantle. Even the most skeptical onlookers feel it. Something has happened here that cannot be explained by reason or rehearsed theatrics. Malcolm's entire posture has changed. The confident, media-polished man seen so often in interviews and red carpets now appears vulnerable, exposed, and utterly real. The layers of performance, the practiced persona gone. What remains is a man undone by grace. His eyes glassy and red, from tears hold depths of sorrow, joy and astonishment that seem to span decades. When he finally finds the strength to speak, his voice is almost unrecognizable, fragile, thick, reverent. "How did you know?" Malcolm whispers each syllable, cracking under the weight of wonder. "The things you said, the moment in my childhood, the private prayers, the silent choices. How could you possibly know?" The question lingers in the air like incense, thick with sacred awe. It's not accusatory. It's acknowledgement that this moment could not have been orchestrated by any human hand. Jonathan looks at him with a mixture of compassion and his own stunned reverence. "I didn't know," he says quietly, his voice trembling with the aftershock of what just occurred. "I just shared what was given to me. This wasn't about me knowing anything. This was Jesus speaking to your heart through a dream he let me carry." That humility, only deepens the miracle. Around them, the studio bursts not into noise, but into a kind of stunned, reverent applause. Viewers are crying. Some are praying. Others have instinctively pulled out their phones recording, knowing they've just witnessed a moment that will echo for years. Mara Ellis. The host tries to regain her composure, but her voice wavers as she addresses the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she says, barely above a whisper, "I think we've just witnessed something beyond extraordinary." Her usual confidence is gone, replaced by wide-eyed wonder. What do you say when God walks onto a morning show? Malcolm reaches across the space between their chairs and grips Jonathan's hand tightly, like a man grabbing hold of a lifeline tossed from heaven. "Thank you," he says, and his voice carries the weight of 1,000 moments, all the hidden battles, all the private pain. "Thank you for being faithful to deliver what he gave you." Their joined hands complete something like a spiritual circuit being closed. And together, as if cued by heaven, they bow their heads in prayer. The cameras roll silently, capturing this unscripted moment of divine intimacy. There's no prompting, no direction. Just two men, one obedient, the other rescued, locked in the mystery of God's love. When they lift their heads again, something has changed. Their faces shine, not metaphorically, but truly illuminated with a peace and joy that radiates beyond the confines of their skin. The lighting in the studio seems softer, more golden, as if the air itself has been anointed. Crew members later report that the room's temperature seemed to shift. Warmer, lighter, more live. "I feel like I've been carrying weights I didn't even know were there," Malcolm says. His voice is stronger now, but still choked with awe. "And somehow, through your obedience, through that dream, God just lifted them all. And he says it not with shame, not with embarrassment, but with a freedom that only comes when a man has been seen healed and made whole." The moment crests like a symphonic wave as both men rise from their seats, seemingly pulled by an invisible thread of divine urgency. They move towards each other slowly, then embrace not the brisk performative hug of celebrities, but a raw, unfiltered connection between two men who have in this moment become spiritual brothers. The hug lingers far beyond what television would normally allow. No one dares to interrupt. Even the cameramen seem frozen, sensing that time has momentarily yielded to something eternal. As they finally part, the weight of the spiritual atmosphere begins to ease, settling into a stillness that feels reverent, like the hush after a thunderstorm. But the sense of sacred presence remains thick, unmistakable. Malcolm Reed wipes at his eyes with the back of his hand, his trademark smile emerging once more. Though this time it's not the familiar camera-ready grin. It's gentler now. Real. "I thought I came here to promote a film," he says with a husky laugh, his voice catching on emotion. "Turns out God brought me here to operate on my soul." Jonathan Roumie nods, his expression open, trembling with awe. "I had no idea this was going to happen," he admits, his voice low but steady. "Honestly, I almost didn't share that dream. I thought people would think I was out of line, or maybe just strange." His humility only amplifies the impact of what has unfolded. It takes real courage to speak when you're unsure if your words will be accepted, but even more to obey when the prompting comes from a higher place. Leah Cruz, who has up until now been nearly speechless, finally finds her voice again. "Gentlemen, She says, her tone slower, softer. The edge of professionalism now edged with reverence. I think our viewers would agree. What we just witnessed wasn't ordinary television. It was something orchestrated far beyond our control. Her words give language to what everyone in the room feels, that they've all been caught up in a divine appointment. The studio audience begins to rise unprompted. A second standing ovation fills the space, this one different, more worship than applause. People are crying openly. Some have their hands lifted. Others clasp them together in silent prayer. It's as if they all instinctively know they've just witnessed something sacred, something heaven sent. They are not just viewers anymore. They are participants in holy ground. Malcolm turns to the camera, eyes still glistening, but his voice now clear, grounded in something deeper. If you're watching this, he says, and you've been wondering if God sees you, if he hears your prayers, he does. He absolutely does. The authority in his voice is unmistakable. Not the authority of celebrity, but of someone who has stood at the intersection of doubt and revelation and walked out transformed. What happened here today is proof. God still speaks, still heals, still shows up in the most unexpected places. In the days following the broadcast, ripple effects begin to form across the globe. Malcolm Reed later describes how he walked out of that studio feeling weightless, like he had been carrying invisible burdens for decades, and God had lifted them in an instant. His private fears, the gnawing questions that had kept him awake at night, are now replaced by an immovable assurance that God is not only real, but intimately involved in his story. Jonathan, equally transformed, finds himself overwhelmed not by publicity, but by the outpouring of testimonies. Thousands write in from around the world. People who had given up on their faith say they were stirred to believe again. Viewers tell him they finally found the courage to step into their calling. Others confess they wept as they watched, sensing God's presence through the screen in a way they had never experienced before. And that prophetic dream, it's already unfolding. Malcolm reaches out personally to Jonathan just days later. Not to say thank you, but to ask how they can collaborate, how they can tell stories together that speak truth, stir faith, and spark healing. What began as a supernatural moment on live television has become the beginning of a creative partnership with kingdom impact. They start discussing films, projects, initiatives, ways to marry art with authenticity, and use media as a vehicle for the miraculous. Leah Cruz, deeply shaken and inspired, later calls that morning the most important moment of her entire career. In interviews, she speaks candidly about how it forced her to re-examine her own relationship with God. Since then, she has intentionally restructured her show's format, dedicating segments to faith-centered stories. Stories that she now believes can heal just as much as entertain. And something begins to stir across the industry. Other public figures, actors, musicians, athletes feel a shift. Malcolm's public vulnerability gives them permission to be human again, to step outside the rigid mold of celebrity and into the freedom of faith. Many begin speaking more openly about their own spiritual journeys, not for clicks or trends, but because something has genuinely awakened inside them. So maybe you're watching this story right now and something's stirring in you too. Maybe you felt invisible, unsure if God knows your name or cares about the weight you carry silently each day. Maybe you've never had a moment like Malcolm or Jonathan, but you've longed for one. The truth is, this story was never just about two men on a TV set. It was a window into a much bigger truth. God is still speaking. He still draws near. And He's not looking for perfect people. He's just looking for open ones. So if your heart is burning, if something in this story has resonated with your soul, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts, your own moments of divine encounter in the comments below. Let this be a place where faith is reignited, where questions find peace, and where stories like Malcolm's remind you you're not alone and your story is not over. Subscribe for more stories like this, because we believe God is still writing miracles. And you just might be part of the next chapter.